Israel's now launched a new round of strikes across Gaza and Yemen, killing dozens, including children, and it's coming as Israel claims it's killed the leader of Hamas, which actually could put a peace deal even further out of reach if that was ever really a goal. But where we're going to start is with this tense humanitarian situation in Gaza and aid distribution sites. Because since March, Israel has blocked off aid to Gaza, but then on Tuesday, it allowed the group Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to roll out new aid centers. And while there were multiple locations, the one in Tel al-Sutton near the southern city of Rafah, it was the site of absolute chaos for a while. Because as you might imagine, there was a massive crowd wanting to score anything, and they quickly got out of control. With footage showing the group breaking barriers and rushing the aid, and then nearby Israeli forces probably didn't help things when they fired what they called warning shots, which led to the crowd stampeding as it fled the area. Initially, it was also thought this was fire conducted by a plane or a helicopter, but the IDF denied that and said it was just ground troops. However, according to reports at the site itself, the staff and armed contractors had an actual plan to avoid bloodshed. With the group Gaza Humanitarian Foundation saying that as soon as it was clear that things were going to be a shit show, they fled. And then local Palestinian staff formed a cordon around the crowd to try and somewhat contain things, which worked because things eventually calmed down and no shots had to be fired. And the good news here is that this does appear to be an isolated incident and the other sites had no real issues. And all of that is notably, this is not a small amount of aid either, and it's mostly in the form of long-lasting food items. You're looking at things like flour, pasta, rice, beans, and when taken together, they reportedly feed 5.5 people for 3.5 days, totaling 462,000 meals. A number that importantly is expected to rise as more and more aid centers are opened up. And then, in addition to that, you had the absolutely massive news that Israel allegedly killed Hamas leader Mohammed Sinwar, with him being the brother of Hamas's former leader before taking over the position following his death in southern Gaza. And in a speech to lawmakers, you had Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu bragging that, quote, "We changed the face of the Middle East. We pushed the terrorists from our territories. We entered the Gaza Strip with force. We eliminated tens of thousands of terrorists. We eliminated Mohammed Daif, Ismail Haniyeh, Yahya Sinwar, and Mohammed Sinwar." And notably, Sinwar seems to have actually been killed almost 2 weeks ago, but the group refused to acknowledge his death at the time. And that is, it's not like the Israeli government was rushing to release the news. Because for many Israelis, Sinwar's death is probably a symbolic victory, but for the government, it might be a catch-22. And that because as they continue to assassinate Hamas leadership, it becomes increasingly unclear who is actually leading the group. And that then also makes it harder to negotiate a peace deal, which, speaking of that, there's a ton of confusion about whether a deal is actually on the table right now. Because you had reports coming out over the past few days that Hamas was agreeing to a 60-day truce proposed by American Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, a deal that would also include exchanging 10 of the still living Israeli hostages for Palestinian prisoners. However, you then had Israel and the US denying the claims that any ceasefire was going to happen, and a US official even said that what Witkoff saw from Hamas was, quote, disappointing and completely unacceptable, which kind of paints the picture that he's not exactly close to making a ceasefire happen. Though then, with that, speaking of deals that kind of involve Hamas, Trump, he's continuing to try and secure some kind of Iran nuclear deal. Though there, Trump's negotiations really haven't seemed to move much, with Iran's foreign minister swearing last week that, "I have said it before and I repeat it again, uranium enrichment in Iran will continue with or without an agreement." For the American side, that's a huge red flag because while most negotiations seem to allow some enrichment, there's a push to stop it before it gets to the point where they can make weapons. And that is, Netanyahu hasn't helped things because he's out there saying that Israel is going to strike Iranian nuclear facilities without any American involvement. And to be clear, Israel isn't involved in the negotiations directly, but these statements from a US ally in the region, it complicates things. And that's before we even mention that Israel may not be bluffing here. Because while they have definitely bluffed about conducting strikes before, they've also actually carried out enough to make their threats credible. And then, speaking of Israeli strikes, we can't forget about the one that they just carried out against Yemen. With those strikes hitting Yemen's Sana'a airport and coming just a few days after the Houthi group launched their own missiles into Israel, with the group also claiming that the strike destroyed the last civilian planes Yemeni Airways operates from that airport. And while it doesn't appear like anyone was on the plane, reportedly it was scheduled to take Muslim pilgrims on the Hajj, which is a pretty big deal for Muslims. So Israeli sources have painted a very different picture, and they claim that the planes are used by the Houthis. And following the attack, you had Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz warning, "This is a clear message and a continuation of our policy. Whoever fires at the state of Israel will pay a heavy price." And that, as the strike also means that the Sana'a airport was only back in service for like a week following strikes by the US. And that is, in the background, there's been some debate about how effective targeting the airport actually has been, because it's mostly used for Yemeni Airways flights and UN planes. But then stepping back a bit, it's also easy to see how Israel views all of this as part of a greater conflict with Iran. With, for example, Netanyahu going out and saying, "But as I have said more than once, the Houthis are only the symptom. The main driving force behind them is Iran, which is responsible for the aggression emanating from Yemen." And in the past, he's made similar statements about Hezbollah and Hamas, both of which are funded and armed by Iran. But for now, that's where we are, and we'll talk about this again soon because there's breaking news every day that ends with a Y there.